The small bookshop on Pine Street wasn't much to look at from the outside. Its faded sign swung gently in the autumn breeze, and the display window needed a good cleaning. But for the locals of Riverdale, it was a treasure trove of forgotten stories. For the past 15 years, the shop had been owned by Mr. Chen, a soft-spoken elderly man with reading glasses that always sat at the tip of his nose. Among the regular visitors was a 34-year-old high school history teacher. He wasn't rich by any means, just a regular guy who loved old books and the stories they carried. Every Friday afternoon, after school let out, he would stop by Mr. Chen's shop to browse the new arrivals, mostly second-hand books that people in town had sold or donated. Back again? Mr. Chen would always ask with a knowing smile, even though he knew the answer. Just for a quick look, the teacher would reply, though both men knew he'd spend at least an hour among the shelves. This particular Friday in October was no different. The teacher had had a long week, his students were restless with Halloween approaching, and he'd stayed up late grading papers. But he couldn't break his Friday tradition. As he pushed open the door, the familiar smell of old paper and wood polish greeted him like an old friend. "Ah, right on time," Mr. Chen said from behind the counter where he was carefully mending the spine of an old cookbook. "I got some interesting history books in yesterday. Someone cleared out their grandfather's attic. They're in the back corner." The teacher nodded his thanks and headed to the back of the store, where the history section was housed in tall, dark wooden shelves that reached almost to the ceiling. His fingers trailed along the spines of the books as he scanned the titles, looking for something that caught his eye. After a few minutes, he spotted a thick, leather-bound volume with faded gold lettering, World War II, Untold Frontline Stories. The teacher's heart quickened. This was exactly the kind of book he loved. He taught a unit on World War II every year, and personal accounts always helped bring history alive for his students. He pulled the book from the shelf and opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed but in good condition. As he flipped through, a cream-colored envelope slipped out from between the pages and fell to the floor. The teacher bent down to pick it up, assuming it was just an old bookmark. But the envelope felt thick, like it contained something more than just a slip of paper. It was sealed and had no writing on the outside. The teacher turned it over in his hands, curious. He glanced around, wondering if he should tell Mr. Chen about it, but the old shopkeeper was now busy with a customer at the front. For a moment, he hesitated. Opening someone else's mail, even if it was decades old, felt wrong somehow. But his curiosity won out. He carefully broke the seal of the envelope and looked inside. What he found made his breath catch. Inside was a small stack of black and white photographs, along with several folded papers covered in neat, small handwriting. The top photograph showed a group of soldiers standing in front of what looked like a bunker. They weren't wearing standard American, British, or even German uniforms. Something about them looked different. The teacher gently removed the photos and began to examine them one by one. The second photo showed the same group of men, but this time they were standing around a table covered with maps and what appeared to be technical drawings. The third photo made him freeze. It showed what looked like an unusual aircraft, unlike any World War II plane he had ever seen in his years of studying history. It was disc-shaped, with strange markings on the side that didn't match any country's military insignia he recognized. His hands trembling slightly, the teacher unfolded the papers. They were letters, written in what looked like German. Though he couldn't read German fluently, he recognized enough words to realize these weren't ordinary wartime letters. They contained technical terms, coordinates, and references to experiments. One word jumped out at him repeatedly: Wunderwaffe, wonder weapon. The teacher's mind raced. He knew about the Nazis' desperate attempts to create superweapons toward the end of the war. But most historians agreed that their more exotic projects never got beyond the theoretical stage. These photos and documents suggested otherwise. He carefully returned everything to the envelope and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He would need to translate the letters properly before jumping to conclusions. He bought the book, paying the $15 Mr. Chen asked without haggling as he usually did. "Found something good?" Mr. Chen asked as he wrapped the book in brown paper. "I think so," the teacher replied, trying to keep his voice casual. "Just some first-hand accounts that might interest my students." That night, the teacher couldn't sleep. After dinner, he had spread the contents of the envelope across his kitchen table and taken photos of everything with his phone. He'd used an online translator for some of the German text, but the results were confusing and fragmented. He needed help, professional help. The teacher had a friend who worked at the local university as a German literature professor. He would ask her to translate the letters properly. And he knew a military history buff who might be able to identify the strange aircraft and uniforms. As he finally lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the teacher couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something important, something that might change how we understood a crucial period in world history. Little did he know that the contents of that envelope would soon take him on a journey beyond anything he could have imagined. The secrets hidden between the pages of that second-hand book would not only change his life but would send shockwaves around the world. And it all began with a Friday afternoon visit to a dusty old bookshop on Pine Street. The following morning, the teacher woke up earlier than usual despite it being Saturday. He had barely slept, his mind racing with questions about the mysterious envelope. After a quick breakfast, he called his friend at the university, hoping she wouldn't mind the weekend interruption. "Hey, it's me. Sorry to bother you on a Saturday," he said when she answered. "No problem," she replied, her voice still groggy with sleep. "What's up?" "I found something interesting, some old German documents. I was hoping you might help translate them. I know it's asking a lot, but they seem important." There was a pause on the other end. "Sure, I can take a look. Want to meet at the coffee shop near campus in about an hour?" The teacher agreed and quickly gathered the envelope and its contents, placing everything carefully in a folder. He also brought the book, thinking it might provide some context for the documents. The university professor was already at the coffee shop when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 steaming mugs in front of her. She waved him over. "I ordered your usual," she said, pushing one of the mugs toward him. "Now, show me these mysterious German documents that couldn't wait until Monday." The teacher carefully opened the folder and laid out the photographs and letters on the table between them, keeping them away from the coffee mugs. His friend's expression changed immediately. Her casual smile faded as she examined the first photograph. "Where did you get these?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. "They were inside this book," he replied, showing her the leather-bound volume. "I bought it yesterday at Mr. Chen's shop." She nodded absently, already absorbed in examining the documents. She picked up one of the letters and began to read, her lips moving silently as she translated the German text in her head. "This is unusual," she said after a few minutes. "The language is technical, but there are references here to something called Die Glock, the bell. It was rumored to be a secret Nazi technology project, but most historians consider it a myth." The teacher leaned forward. "What kind of project?" According to the letter, it was some sort of anti-gravity device. The writer describes experiments conducted in a facility in Lower Silesia, what's now part of Poland. She continued reading, her brow furrowed in concentration. There are mentions of strange side effects, test subjects experiencing time disorientation, metals turning to liquid at room temperature, and plants near the test site aging years within hours. The teacher's heart raced. If these documents were authentic, they could provide evidence for one of World War II's most persistent mysteries. "Who wrote the letters?" he asked. His friend flipped to the end of one document. "It's signed by someone named Dr. Heinrich Müller. He appears to be writing to a superior, explaining why they need more resources for the project." She looked up at the teacher. This is serious stuff. If these are authentic, they could change our understanding of Nazi scientific programs. And the aircraft in the photos? Could it be related to this Bell project? She studied the photograph again. Possibly. The shape is consistent with descriptions of Die Glock, bell-shaped or disc-like. But I'm not an expert on military hardware. They spent the next 2 hours going through the documents, the professor translating key passages while the teacher took notes. By the time they finished their second round of coffee, they had pieced together an extraordinary story. According to the documents, a secret SS scientific division had been working on technology that defied conventional physics, anti-gravity propulsion, energy weapons, and possibly even experiments with time distortion. The writer, Dr. Muller, seemed convinced that these technologies could turn the tide of the war, but he was fighting against skepticism from his superiors and a lack of resources. The final letter was dated March 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. In it, Muller mentioned that they were dismantling the facility and moving the core technology to a secure location. He wrote cryptically about ensuring our work continues beyond the Reich's current difficulties. This suggests that some of these scientists might have escaped with their research, the professor said quietly. There were Operation Paperclip and similar programs where Allied forces recruited Nazi scientists after the war, but some disappeared completely. The teacher sat back in his chair, trying to process everything. If these documents are real, why were they hidden in this book? And who put them there? His friend shook her head. I don't know, but there's something else that bothers me. She pointed to the back of one of the photographs. This paper isn't from the 1940s. The texture, the printing quality, this is much more recent. Maybe the 1970s or 1980s. These might be copies of original documents. The teacher felt a chill. If these were copies made decades after the war, who had access to the originals? And why hide them in a random book? As they were packing up the documents, his phone buzzed with a text from his other friend, the military history buff. He had sent photos of the documents the night before. The message read, "Where did you get these? Call me ASAP. Don't show anyone else." The teacher showed the message to his professor friend. Her expression grew serious. Maybe we should be careful with these, she said quietly. If they're authentic, they could be valuable, or dangerous. There are still people who collect Nazi memorabilia, and others who would pay a lot for evidence of advanced technology. The teacher nodded, suddenly feeling uneasy in the crowded coffee shop. He carefully returned everything to the folder. I'll call him now, he said, reaching for his phone. Thanks for your help with the translation. As he dialed his friend's number, the teacher couldn't shake the feeling that the simple act of buying a second-hand book had set him on a path that was rapidly becoming more complex, and potentially more dangerous, than he could have imagined. Little did he know that across town, someone else was already searching for the envelope and its contents, someone who had been tracking these documents for years and would stop at nothing to get them back. The military history buff lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. His front yard was neat but plain, nothing like the inside of his home, which the teacher knew was filled with carefully organized display cases of military artifacts, maps, and books. When the teacher pulled into the driveway, his friend was already waiting at the door. He looked anxious, glancing up and down the street before waving the teacher inside. You brought everything? He asked as soon as the door closed behind them. The teacher nodded, patting the folder under his arm. Yes, but you're making me nervous. What's going on? His friend led him through a narrow hallway into his study. Unlike the rest of the house, which was meticulously organized, the study looked like it had been ransacked. Books and papers were scattered across the desk and floor, and his computer showed multiple open browser windows. I've been researching all night, he explained, clearing a space on the desk. Let me see the originals. The teacher carefully laid out the contents of the envelope. His friend put on a pair of white cotton gloves before touching anything, which struck the teacher as oddly formal. "I've never seen you use gloves for your collection before," the teacher remarked. "This isn't like my collection," his friend replied without looking up. "If these are what I think they are, they're way more significant than memorabilia." For several minutes, the military buff examined each photograph and document in silence, occasionally using a magnifying glass to study details. Finally, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. "Where exactly did you find these?" he asked. The teacher explained about the bookstore and the leather-bound volume. "My friend at the university translated some of the German. She mentioned something called Die Glock." His friend nodded. "The bell. It's one of the most persistent mysteries from the Nazi scientific program. There are researchers who've spent their entire careers trying to prove it existed." He pointed to one of the photographs. "And this aircraft, it matches descriptions I've read, but I've never seen actual photos before." "So you think these are authentic?" The military buff hesitated. "That's the complicated part. The content seems authentic, the technical details, the names mentioned, the locations, it all aligns with what serious researchers believe about Die Glock. But like your professor friend noticed, these aren't original 1940s documents. They're more recent reproductions." "Why would someone make copies?" the teacher asked. "That's what's been keeping me up all night," his friend replied, turning to his computer. "Look at this." On the screen was an old newspaper article from 1983. The headline read, "Former government researcher dies in mysterious house fire." This is Dr. Thomas Warren. He worked for the U.S. government on classified aerospace projects in the 1960s and 70s. According to some sources, he was part of a team that studied captured Nazi technology after the war. He scrolled down to show a photograph of a middle-aged man standing in front of what looked like a research facility. 3 weeks before he died, Warren gave an interview to a small UFO magazine. He claimed that the government had recovered Nazi scientific documents that detailed technology, at least 50 years ahead of its time. He promised to provide evidence in a follow-up interview, but died before that could happen. The teacher felt a chill run down his spine. "You think these documents might be the evidence he was planning to share?" "Possibly. The timing fits, these reproductions look like they're from that era. And there's something else." He pointed to a small mark in the corner of one of the photographs, a sequence of numbers and letters that looked like a code. "That's a classified document tracking number from that period. It's the kind of marking the government used for sensitive materials. If these are fake, whoever created them knew exactly what they were doing." The teacher sat down heavily in the spare chair. What had started as a curious discovery was turning into something much bigger, and potentially more dangerous. "So what do we do now?" he asked. His friend leaned forward, his voice dropping even though they were alone in the house. "First, we need to figure out how these ended up in that book. Did you ask the bookstore owner about where it came from?" The teacher shook his head. "Mr. Chen just said someone cleared out their grandfather's attic. I could go back and ask for more details." "We should do that. And I have a contact, someone who used to work in government archives. She might be able to verify if these document numbers are genuine." He paused, looking intently at the teacher. "But we need to be careful. If these are authentic, they could be worth a lot of money to collectors. Or worse, they could put us on the radar of people who don't want this information public." "You really think this is that serious?" the teacher asked, trying to keep the skepticism from his voice. His friend's expression remained grave. 3 people who claimed to have evidence about Die Glock died under suspicious circumstances in the 1980s. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe not. But I don't think we should take chances. As if to emphasize his point, a car drove slowly past the house, its tires crunching on the gravel road. Both men instinctively turned to look out the window. It was probably nothing, just a neighbor or someone lost, but the teacher couldn't help feeling watched. "Take these home and keep them somewhere safe," his friend advised, carefully returning the documents to the folder. "Don't tell anyone else about them for now. I'll make some calls and see what I can find out about Dr. Warren and his research." That night, the teacher couldn't sleep again. He kept the folder hidden inside a locked box in his closet, but it felt like it was burning a hole through the metal and wood, demanding attention. He found himself wondering about the person who had hidden these documents in the book. Was it Dr. Warren himself, trying to preserve evidence before something happened to him? Or someone else entirely, someone who might now be looking for what the teacher had found? As dawn broke, his phone rang. It was his military history buff friend, his voice tense. "Someone broke into my house last night while I was out. They didn't take anything valuable, just went through my study. I think they were looking for those documents." The teacher's blood ran cold. How would anyone even know about them? "I don't know," his friend replied, "but you need to be careful. I'm coming over." The teacher hung up the phone and went to check the locked box in his closet. Everything was still there, but for how long would it remain safe? And how far was he willing to go to uncover the truth behind what he had found? The teacher paced nervously around his small living room, checking the windows every few minutes. After his friend's call about the break-in, he had retrieved the folder from its hiding place and now kept it close, unsure what to do next. A knock at the door made him jump. He peered through the peephole to see his military buff friend standing on the porch, looking around nervously. The teacher quickly let him in. "Did anyone follow you?" the teacher asked, surprising himself with the question. Just 3 days ago, such paranoia would have seemed ridiculous to him. "I don't think so. I took a roundabout way here," his friend replied, dropping his backpack on the couch. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes. "They went through everything in my study, every book, every file. They knew what they were looking for." "But how would anyone know about the documents?" the teacher asked again. "I only showed them to you and my professor friend." His friend shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe someone at the coffee shop overheard you. Maybe the bookstore owner knows more than he let on." He pulled a laptop from his backpack. "I contacted my friend who works in archives. She can't meet in person, but she agreed to video chat." They set up the laptop on the kitchen table. After a few rings, a woman with gray hair and glasses appeared on the screen. She looked to be in her 60s, with a serious expression that softened slightly when she saw the military buff. "Hi there," she said. "You said this was important?" "Thanks for doing this," he replied. "We need your expertise." He introduced the teacher and briefly explained the situation. The teacher held up one of the documents to the camera, pointing out the code in the corner. "We're trying to determine if this classification marking is authentic." The woman leaned closer to her screen, studying the image. "Can you zoom in on that part?" she asked. They adjusted the camera to give her a better view of the marking. "That looks like a genuine Majestic Series classification," she said after a moment. "Those were used for certain aerospace and technology projects in the 1970s. She frowned. "But those documents were supposed to be secured in special facilities. No copies should exist outside of those locations." "Could they have been leaked?" the teacher asked. "It's possible. There was a period in the late 70s and early 80s when security protocols were changing. Some documents went missing during transfers between facilities." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "Look, I shouldn't even be acknowledging these classification series exist. If these are authentic, they're still considered sensitive material." The military buff leaned forward. "Do you know anything about a Dr. Thomas Warren?" The woman's expression changed subtly, a flash of recognition quickly masked. "Why do you ask about him?" "His name came up in our research." She was quiet for a moment, seemingly weighing her words. Warren was controversial. Brilliant, but increasingly paranoid toward the end of his career. He became convinced that certain technologies were being hidden from the public. She sighed. His death was unfortunate. A lot of knowledge was lost. Was he working on anything related to recovered Nazi technology? The teacher asked. The woman's eyes narrowed. I think we should end this conversation. My advice to you both is to turn those documents over to the proper authorities. If they're authentic, they don't belong in private hands. Before either of them could respond, she ended the call. The two men sat in silence for a moment. She knows something, the military buff finally said. That reaction when I mentioned Warren, she definitely knew him or knew of his work. The teacher rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. This is getting complicated. Maybe she's right. Maybe we should turn these over to authorities. But which authorities? His friend countered. If these documents reveal classified technology that's been hidden from the public, the same agencies might just bury them again. He began pacing. We need more information before we decide what to do. The teacher's phone rang. It was his professor friend. He put it on speaker. I've been doing more research on Die Glock, she said without preamble. There's something odd. A Polish researcher who investigated the site where the device was supposedly tested died in 2014. His final paper mentioned finding radiation levels consistent with the effects described in your documents. Did he have any connection to Dr. Warren? The military buff asked. I don't know about Warren, but he cited an anonymous American source who provided technical specifications. She paused. There's something else. The bookstore where you found those documents, I looked it up. The property was purchased 15 years ago by a corporation called Millennium Archives Incorporated. What's strange about that? The teacher asked. Millennium Archives was a shell company linked to a former defense contractor. They closed down in 2018 after an investigation into improper storage of classified materials. The teacher looked at the book sitting on his coffee table. So the bookstore might be more than it appears? It's a stretch, she admitted, but it's an odd coincidence. After hanging up, the teacher and his friend decided their next step should be to return to the bookstore and question Mr. Chen. They drove separately, agreeing to meet there. The teacher arrived first, parking across the street. As he waited for his friend, he noticed a black SUV with tinted windows parked down the block. Two men in suits sat inside, apparently watching the bookstore. His phone buzzed with a text from his friend, being followed. We'll meet you later. Be careful. The teacher's heart raced. Should he leave? But this might be his only chance to get answers from Mr. Chen. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the street and entered the bookshop. The familiar smell of old books greeted him, but today it brought no comfort. Mr. Chen was helping another customer. When he saw the teacher, something flickered across his face. Surprise? Concern? The teacher browsed nervously until the other customer left. As soon as they were alone, Mr. Chen spoke first. You found it, didn't you? His voice was quiet but intense, nothing like his usual gentle tone. The teacher froze. Found what? Don't play games. The envelope. In the war book. Mr. Chen moved from behind the counter. We need to talk, but not here. He flipped the open sign to closed and locked the front door. Follow me. Stunned, the teacher followed the elderly man through a beaded curtain at the back of the shop, into a small office. Mr. Chen closed the door behind them and turned to face the teacher. I've been waiting for someone to find those documents for 5 years. I was beginning to think I'd chosen the wrong book. You put them there? The teacher asked incredulously. Not me, Mr. Chen said, shaking his head. My brother-in-law. He worked with Dr. Warren. Before he died, he asked me to hide the envelope where someone might eventually find it, someone who would understand its importance. Outside, car doors slammed. Mr. Chen glanced nervously toward the front of the shop. "We don't have much time," he said urgently. "There's more you need to know. The technology in those documents? It wasn't just theoretical. They built it. And it worked." The sound of someone trying the locked front door made both men freeze. Through the small window in the office door, the teacher could see shadows moving in the bookshop. "Is there another way out?" he whispered. Mr. Chen nodded and moved to a tall bookshelf against the wall. He pushed it aside with surprising strength for a man his age, revealing a narrow door. "The buildings on this block are connected by old service passages," he explained quietly. "Prohibition-era tunnels. Come." The teacher hesitated. "The men outside, who are they?" "People who have been searching for those documents for decades," Mr. Chen replied, his voice urgent. "We need to move." As if to emphasize his point, there was a loud crack from the front of the store. Someone was forcing the door. They slipped through the hidden door into a dimly lit corridor that smelled of damp stone and dust. Mr. Chen pulled the bookshelf back into place behind them, then led the way down the passage, using the flashlight on his phone to guide them. "My brother-in-law worked with Dr. Warren at a facility in Nevada," Mr. Chen explained as they hurried through the corridor. "He was an engineer specializing in propulsion systems. What they were working on, it wasn't just theoretical. The Nazi scientists brought over after the war had working prototypes." "Of the bell?" the teacher asked, struggling to keep up with the surprisingly agile old man. "Yes, but they called it Project Kronos by then. My brother-in-law said it was more than just anti-gravity technology. The device created what they called temporal displacement fields." The teacher almost stumbled. "Are you saying it was a time machine?" Mr. Chen shook his head. "Not exactly. The fields distorted time locally, slowed it down or sped it up in a contained area. They were studying its potential for energy production, weapons, even preserving human life. But there were side effects. They reached a junction in the tunnel." Mr. Chen paused, considering which way to go. "The test subjects experienced severe health problems," he continued, choosing the right-hand passage. "Rapid aging, cellular degradation, memory loss. The government shut down the project officially, but Warren believed they continued the work in deeper black programs." "And the documents I found?" "Technical schematics, test results, proof that the technology worked. Warren and my brother-in-law were going to go public, believing the potential benefits for humanity outweighed the military applications. But then Warren died in that house fire. They emerged into the basement of what seemed to be an apartment building." Mr. Chen led the way up a service stairwell to a side exit. "My brother-in-law went into hiding after that. He spent years gathering evidence, making copies of everything he could access. But his health was declining, effects from his exposure to the device. Before he died, he entrusted me with the documents and asked me to hide them where they might eventually be found by someone who would know what to do with them." They stepped out into an alley a block away from the bookstore. The teacher could see the black SUV still parked out front, with one man standing guard while others presumably searched inside. "Why me?" the teacher asked. "I'm just a high school history teacher." Mr. Chen smiled slightly. "The book you found, it was a trap of sorts. Only someone with genuine interest in obscure World War II history would purchase it. Someone educated, curious, likely to recognize the significance of what they found." He looked at the teacher appraisingly. "My brother-in-law believed that academics and teachers would prioritize truth over power. Was he wrong?" Before the teacher could answer, his phone vibrated. A text from his military history buff friend. "Where are you?" I shook my tail. The teacher quickly replied with their location, and Mr. Chen nodded his approval. "We should keep moving," the old man said. Is there somewhere safe we can go? Somewhere not connected to you? The teacher thought for a moment. My professor friend has a cabin by the lake. She offered it to me last summer when I was working on research. I still have the key. Good. Contact her, but don't tell her exactly why we need it. The fewer details we share electronically, the better. As they walked briskly toward the teacher's car parked several blocks away, he sent a carefully worded message to his professor friend, asking if the cabin was available for an urgent writing retreat. Her reply came quickly, of course. Everything okay? Fine, he replied. Just need some space to work on a project. Thanks. His military buff friend met them at the car. His face was flushed, and he looked anxiously over his shoulder. I thought I lost them, but I'm not sure, he said. Who were those guys? We need to get to the lake cabin, the teacher replied instead of answering. I'll explain on the way. During the hour-long drive to the lake, Mr. Chen filled them in on more details. The technology described in the documents had been developed to near operational status in the 1970s. The bell-shaped craft wasn't just a propulsion system, it was a vehicle designed to operate within a temporally distorted field. The final tests showed they could accelerate time inside the craft while time outside remained normal, Mr. Chen explained. A pilot could experience a 1-hour flight while only minutes passed in the outside world. That would revolutionize space travel, the military buff said, his eyes wide. You could reach Mars in what felt like days instead of months. Exactly. But the biological effects on the pilots were catastrophic. And there were other phenomena they couldn't explain, objects inside the field aging differently depending on their composition, energy readings that violated laws of physics. The teacher, focused on driving, tried to process everything. If this technology exists, why hide it? Why not develop it safely? Mr. Chen looked out the window at the passing landscape. Control. Whoever masters this technology controls more than just advanced transportation. They control time itself, at least on a limited scale. My brother-in-law believed certain elements within the government decided this was too powerful to share, even with allies. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the small wooden structure nestled among pine trees overlooking the lake. It was isolated, the nearest neighbor was at least half a mile away. As they unloaded the car, the military buff suddenly stopped and pointed toward the lake. A drone hovered in the distance, almost invisible against the darkening sky. We've been followed, he said quietly. The teacher looked at Mr. Chen, whose weathered face showed no surprise. They've always been one step behind, the old man said simply. But now we need to be one step ahead. It's time to release what we know to the world. Inside the cabin, the three men gathered around the small dining table. The teacher spread out the documents from the envelope while his military buff friend kept watch at the window, tracking the drone's movements until it disappeared into the night sky. They'll be coming, Mr. Chen said matter-of-factly. We have maybe a few hours. The teacher ran his hands through his hair, the reality of their situation sinking in. I don't understand. Why now? These documents have been hidden for years. Why are they so desperate to recover them at this moment? Mr. Chen's expression darkened. Because they're restarting the program. My contacts in the scientific community have noticed patterns, unexplained equipment purchases, specialists in quantum physics and temporal mechanics being recruited for classified projects. He tapped one of the documents. The technology described here was ahead of its time in the 1970s. They lacked the computing power and materials science to fully realize its potential. But now, they could actually build a working version, the military buff finished, returning to the table. Exactly. And if the side effects haven't been resolved, it could be catastrophic. The teacher looked between the two men. So what do we do? We can't exactly walk into a newspaper office with this. No mainstream outlet would touch it without extensive verification, which would take too long, the military buff agreed. And digital options are risky, the documents could be buried or discredited before they gain traction. Mr. Chen had been quietly examining the cabin. Does this place have internet? The teacher nodded. Satellite connection. My professor friend uses it for research retreats. Then we have what we need. Mr. Chen pulled out an old flip phone, not the smartphone he'd used earlier. I've prepared for this possibility for years. There's a network of researchers, journalists, and former government employees who investigate classified projects. People who would recognize the significance of these documents immediately. He flipped open the phone and dialed a number from memory. After a brief conversation in hushed tones, he turned back to the others. We're going to live stream the documents and our story. Multiple platforms simultaneously, with automatic uploads to secure servers around the world. Once it's out there, it can't be completely erased. The military buff looked skeptical. That's your plan? A live stream? We'll be arrested within hours. Perhaps, Mr. Chen acknowledged. But the information will be free. And that's what matters. The teacher felt a strange calm settle over him. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been grading papers before the weekend. Now he was about to become part of exposing what could be one of the biggest government secrets in history. I'll do it, he said. It should come from me. I found the documents, and I don't have the obvious connections that might make people dismiss this as a conspiracy theory. He looked at Mr. Chen. No offense, but a high school teacher is more relatable than someone who's been investigating government secrets for decades. Mr. Chen smiled slightly. My brother-in-law chose well. They spent the next hour preparing. The teacher read through all the documents again, making sure he understood the key points. Mr. Chen contacted more people from his network, arranging for the live stream to be picked up and distributed. The military buff created a simple but effective setup using the cabin's desk lamp and a white sheet as a backdrop. As they worked, the teacher sent a message to his professor friend, "Thank you for the cabin. I'm sorry to involve you in this, but what I've found is important. Watch the live stream tonight. If anything happens to me, the leather book is in my classroom desk, bottom drawer." Her reply came quickly, "What's going on? Are you in trouble?" He didn't respond. There wasn't time to explain, and he didn't want to put her at risk by sharing more information. At 11 o'clock, they were ready. The teacher sat at the desk, documents arranged neatly beside him. The military buff had his phone set up on a makeshift tripod, ready to broadcast. Remember, Mr. Chen advised, stick to the facts. Show the documents clearly. Don't speculate beyond what we know for certain. The teacher nodded, his mouth dry. What about you? Do you want to appear on camera? The old man shook his head. My face would raise red flags immediately. They've been watching me for years. This needs to come from you. With a deep breath, the teacher signaled he was ready. The military buff started the live stream, connecting to multiple platforms using links Mr. Chen had provided. My name is, the teacher began, then stopped himself. Actually, who I am isn't important. What matters is what I found. He held up the leather-bound book. 3 days ago, I purchased this book about World War II from a local second-hand bookstore. Inside was an envelope containing what appeared to be classified government documents. Slowly and methodically, he went through each document, explaining what it showed and the implications. He described the Nazi Bell project, its evolution into Project Chronos, and the temporal displacement technology it had developed. These documents suggest that by the 1970s, the United States government had developed technology that could manipulate time within a contained field, he explained, holding up the technical schematics. The potential applications are staggering, from space travel to energy production to weapons systems. But the side effects on living organisms were catastrophic. As he spoke, the viewer count climbed steadily. Comments flooded in, some dismissive, others asking questions, still others expressing shock. I don't know why this technology was buried, the teacher continued. But I believe the public deserves to know about it. If these documents are authentic, and we have reason to believe they are, then we need a transparent conversation about this technology and its implications. He was about to show the final photograph when the cabin lights flickered. The military buff glanced at his phone. "We're getting signal interference," he said tensely. Outside, they heard the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors approaching. Mr. Chen moved quickly to the window and peered through the blinds. "They're here sooner than I expected." The teacher looked directly into the camera. "We're about to have company. If this stream cuts off, remember what you've seen. These documents will be uploaded to multiple secure locations. The truth is now in your hands." The helicopter sounds grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. "Keep broadcasting as long as you can," Mr. Chen urged the military buff, who nodded grimly. The teacher took a deep breath and continued speaking, even as bright spotlights from outside began to shine through the cabin windows. His voice remained steady as he revealed the final, most damning piece of evidence, a photograph showing the successful test of the temporal displacement device, with clear measurements showing how time had been altered within the test chamber. "This technology exists," he said firmly. "And now you know too." There was a loud pounding on the cabin door. "Federal agents. Open up." The live stream viewer count had surpassed 1 million. The door burst open. Men in dark tactical gear flooded into the cabin, weapons raised. On the ground. "Now," one of them shouted. The teacher raised his hands slowly, maintaining eye contact with the camera for as long as possible. The military buff kept filming, backing away until one of the agents grabbed his phone and shut off the live stream. Mr. Chen stood calmly by the window, hands visible but his posture dignified, almost defiant. "It's too late," he said to the lead agent. "The world has seen it now." They were separated, handcuffed, and led outside where 3 black SUVs and a helicopter waited. The teacher caught a glimpse of the night sky, stars twinkling indifferently above the chaos below, before a hood was placed over his head. What followed were hours of isolation in what felt like a small, windowless room. When the hood was finally removed, the teacher found himself sitting at a metal table across from a middle-aged woman in a crisp suit. Her expression gave nothing away, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" she asked without preamble. The teacher straightened in his chair despite his exhaustion. "I showed people the truth. You exposed classified materials that could damage national security. I exposed a technology that could benefit humanity if developed responsibly and transparently." The teacher leaned forward. "Where are my friends?" The woman ignored the question. "The documents you found, did it ever occur to you they might be forgeries? Part of a disinformation campaign by foreign agents?" "Were they?" the teacher asked directly. For a moment, something flickered in the woman's eyes, frustration, perhaps, or reluctant respect. She changed tactics. "You're a history teacher. You understand context, how information can be manipulated when presented selectively. Those documents showed early research with incomplete data and preliminary conclusions. Science is iterative." "Is Project Chronos still active?" the teacher interrupted. The woman fell silent, studying him carefully. "What would you say if I told you it was? That the technology has been refined, the side effects mitigated, and the potential applications could solve some of humanity's most pressing problems? I'd say that's all the more reason the public should know about it." She sighed. "It's never that simple. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Another agent entered and whispered something to the woman. Her expression changed subtly, and she stood. "Wait here," she instructed before leaving the room. Alone again, the teacher closed his eyes, wondering what was happening outside. How many people had seen the live stream? Had the uploads Mr. Chen arranged succeeded? What was happening to his friends? He lost track of time in that featureless room. It could have been minutes or hours later when the door opened again. This time, a different person entered, an older man with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had carried heavy responsibilities for a long time. "We have a problem," the man said without introduction, sitting down across from the teacher. "Your live stream reached nearly 4 million viewers before it was cut off. The uploads can't be contained, they're on servers around the world, being shared and downloaded faster than we can track them." He placed a tablet on the table, showing news headlines from around the globe: classified time displacement technology exposed, government cover-up of Nazi science program revealed, whistleblowers claim U.S. has technology to manipulate time. "The damage is done," the man continued. "We're facing congressional inquiries, international questions, public demands for transparency." He studied the teacher with tired eyes. "You've forced our hand." The teacher remained silent, waiting. "What you don't understand, what your friend Mr. Chen never understood despite his brother-in-law's involvement, is that Project Chronos wasn't abandoned because of a cover-up or power grab. It was contained because of something they discovered in the final phase of testing." The man's voice dropped. "Something none of the documents you found mentioned." The teacher felt a chill. What did they discover? That localized temporal displacement has cascading effects outside the field. Small at first, almost undetectable, but cumulative and irreversible. The more you manipulate time in one location, the more you destabilize it elsewhere. The man looked down at his hands. They didn't just discover how to control time, they discovered it's possible to break it. The news hit the teacher like a physical blow. "Are you saying the technology is actually dangerous on a larger scale? Existentially dangerous." That's why after the initial tests, the research was compartmentalized and virtually frozen. Not to weaponize it or exploit it, but to understand the risks and find safeguards. He stood up. "And now we have billions of people demanding access to something they don't understand the consequences of." The teacher struggled to process this new information. The public deserves to know the risks too. Transparency works both ways. Perhaps you're right. The man moved toward the door. "Which is why the president has authorized a limited disclosure program. We're releasing sanitized versions of the research, including the danger assessments." "And what happens to us?" The man paused. "That's being discussed at levels above my pay grade. But I wanted you to understand what you've really unleashed." The following days passed in a blur. The teacher was moved to a more comfortable facility where he was finally allowed to see news reports about what people were calling the Bell disclosure. Scientific communities worldwide were analyzing the documents, governments were issuing statements, conspiracy theorists were having a field day, and religious leaders were contemplating the theological implications of manipulating time. 1 week after the live stream, the teacher, Mr. Chen, and the military buff were brought to a conference room where the silver-haired man waited with several government officials. "The president has made a decision," he announced. "In light of the extraordinary circumstances and public interest, you're being released under certain conditions." The conditions were strict: signed non-disclosure agreements covering anything they hadn't already revealed, regular check-ins with government liaisons, and the understanding that they would be under surveillance indefinitely. "You'll also participate in a controlled press conference," one of the officials explained. "You'll tell your story, how you found the documents, what you did with them, but emphasize the potential dangers of the technology." Mr. Chen, who had been silent, finally spoke. "And the actual research? Will it continue in secret?" No, the silver-haired man replied. The president has authorized the creation of an international oversight committee, scientists, ethicists, government representatives, to determine how to proceed. Your live stream forced a reckoning we weren't prepared for, but perhaps needed. 2 days later, the teacher stood before a forest of microphones and cameras, blinking against the flashbulbs. Beside him were Mr. Chen and the military buff, all three of them looking somewhat shell-shocked by the events of the past 2 weeks. As he began to speak, telling the now familiar story of finding an envelope in a second-hand book, the teacher caught sight of his professor friend in the crowd. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. "I'm just a history teacher," he concluded after recounting their journey. "I believe we learn from the past to build a better future. What we found wasn't just about secret technology, it was about who we are as a society, how we handle knowledge that could change everything, and whether we trust people with the truth, even when it's frightening." In the months that followed, the world changed in ways both subtle and profound. The International Committee confirmed the dangers of temporal displacement technology but also identified potential safe applications with strict limitations. A new field of temporal physics emerged, drawing brilliant minds from around the globe. As for the teacher, he eventually returned to his classroom, though nothing was quite the same. His students looked at him differently, partly with awe, partly with the usual teenage skepticism. On his desk sat a framed news clipping with the headline that had appeared in papers worldwide. "A man found an envelope in a second-hand book. What was inside shocked the world." Sometimes, during quiet moments, he wondered what might have happened if he'd never pulled that leather-bound volume from the shelf. If he'd never opened that envelope. If time had followed a different path. But history, as he reminded his students, is made of such moments, small choices that sometimes change everything.